It was a warm, quiet evening in a neighborhood that usually slept peacefully. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks and low brick houses. Birds were returning to their nests, and the faint hum of distant traffic mixed with the occasional bark of a dog. On one of the narrow streets, a large black man walked slowly, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the surroundings casually. He moved with a calm presence, the kind of calm that made people take notice without realizing it. He wasn't in a hurry. He had spent the day running errands and now was heading home with a small bag of groceries from the corner store. The streets were familiar, lined with old trees and uneven pavement, and he knew every crack and curb from years of walking the same path. As he passed by a small park, he noticed children playing near the swings and parents chatting on benches. He offered a small nod to a few neighbors he knew, and they nodded back politely. Life felt ordinary, peaceful, almost comforting. But that ordinary evening was about to change in a way he had anticipated, even if the people around him did not know it. From down the street, the sound of an engine broke the quiet. A police car appeared, rolling slowly at first, then stopping near the corner. 2 officers stepped out, their movements sharp and deliberate. The man saw them from the corner of his eye, but did not look nervous. He continued walking slowly, keeping his hands visible but relaxed. There was a calmness about him, but there was also a subtle alertness, a quiet awareness that allowed him to notice things most people would miss. The officers started moving toward him. At first, their approach seemed routine, just a casual stop. But as they got closer, it became clear that they were looking for a confrontation. One of the officers called out, asking for his identification. The man stopped and turned, his movements unhurried. "Evening, officers," he said politely. "Is there a problem?" His voice was calm, steady, with no hint of anger or fear. It was the kind of tone that could either ease tension or, if misread, make someone more aggressive. The officers did not respond politely. One of them stepped closer, his body language rigid, aggressive. "We've had reports about someone acting suspiciously in this area," he said. "We need to see some ID now." The man reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out his wallet. He handed it to the officer without a word, maintaining eye contact but not challenging them. Despite his calmness, the situation escalated. One officer's hand hovered near his belt and the other's voice grew sharper. People walking dogs or sitting on porches began to notice, watching from a distance. The man's heart did not race, but he could feel the tension in the air. He knew that moments like this could spiral out of control if handled carelessly. He also knew something else. He had prepared for situations like this not out of paranoia, but because he understood the world he lived in. The first shove came unexpectedly. One officer reached for his arm as if to grab him, and the man stepped back, keeping his balance. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "Please, just take it easy." But the officers were impatient. They misread his size and presence, assuming that because he was large, he would be easy to overpower. They did not see the intelligence in his eyes, the patience in his stance, or the awareness in every slight movement he made. The man tried to explain himself, pointing to his groceries and mentioning that he had just come from the store. He spoke slowly, making sure every word was heard. "I understand you have a job to do," he said, "but I'm not causing any trouble. I just want to go home." His calmness was almost unnerving, like water that refused to be disturbed by the rocks thrown into it. The officers, however, did not appreciate it. They interpreted his composure as defiance. Around them, a few neighbors had stopped to watch. A woman hanging laundry on her porch whispered to her husband about the officers being too rough. An elderly man leaned on his cane, frowning at what he saw. But the man in the center of this confrontation remained composed, almost serene. He knew how people would react later, how they would question the officer's actions, and he also knew he could control the narrative if he remained calm. The officers attempted to grab him again. This time, one of them reached for his shoulder, pushing him slightly. The man did not stumble, did not yell, did not fight back. Instead, he shifted his weight subtly, moving just enough to avoid the grab without making it obvious. There was a precision in his movements, a quiet skill that suggested he had been trained to handle situations exactly like this. "What's going on here?" a neighbor called out from her porch. The officers did not answer, too focused on the man in front of them. He glanced briefly at the witnesses, acknowledging them with a small nod, reassuring them without a word that he had everything under control. He was calm, measured, and aware of every angle, every person, every potential outcome. The officers, frustrated by his lack of resistance, began to lose control. One of them tried to push him against a wall, but the man sidestepped with ease, his large frame moving in a way that seemed effortless. It was almost like watching a dance, fluid, precise, deliberate. The officer's aggression only made him more alert, more focused, more in control. In the distance, another neighbor grabbed their phone, starting to record the incident. The man noticed but did not flinch. He knew this would be important later, that people would see exactly what had happened. He also knew that recording devices were not just tools for others, they were part of the trap he had subtly set in motion. The officers had no idea. They thought they were confronting a simple, unprepared man, unaware that they had walked right into a situation where appearances were deceptive. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows on the street. The officers' impatience grew. Their shouts became louder, their movements more forceful, but the man remained calm, his breathing steady, his mind clear. Every step, every shift in weight, every glance was deliberate. He was not just reacting, he was observing, calculating, and preparing. And then, just as it seemed the confrontation would erupt into something violent, he paused. He looked the officers in the eyes and spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not your enemy," he said. "I'm just a man trying to go home. Please think about what you're doing." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was profound. It was a moment that revealed his humanity, his patience, and his understanding of how fragile the line between chaos and control could be. The officers hesitated, just for a moment, and in that moment the man's mind raced. He had anticipated their aggression, their arrogance, and their underestimation of him. He had prepared mentally for this, had mapped out every step, every response, and now, in the pause before the next move, he saw the opening he needed. The trap he had set was ready to be activated. The street, quiet moments ago, now seemed tense with anticipation. The neighbors watched silently, sensing something unusual but not knowing what it was. The officers, unaware of the man's plan, were still focused on exerting control, still convinced that they held the power. But the balance of power was about to shift in ways they could never have imagined. For now, the man continued to stand there, calm, patient, observing, and fully aware of the storm he was navigating. Every detail mattered: the placement of his feet, the distance between him and the officers, the watching neighbors, the camera in the distance. Nothing was random. Everything was part of a larger picture he had already seen in his mind. The night was settling in and the shadows grew longer. The air was warm but heavy with tension. The first part of this story ends with the man standing in the street, seemingly just another large man caught in an unfair confrontation. But in reality, he was fully in control. The officers were unaware that the very situation they believed they dominated was already slipping from their grasp. He was calm. He was aware, and he was ready. The air had grown heavier, thick with tension, as the man and the officers faced each other in the dimming light. The street that had seemed peaceful just moments ago now felt different, almost charged, as though it could snap at any second. Every footstep, every shuffle, every quiet breath carried weight. The neighbors who had been watching from their porches or windows remained silent, but their eyes followed every movement. They could sense that something important was happening, though they did not yet understand the full story. The officers grew impatient. Their initial confidence began to waver just slightly, as they tried to assert control over a situation that refused to be simple. One officer moved closer, gesturing sharply with his hands, his voice rising. "Stop resisting and put your hands where we can see them," he barked. The words were harsh and the tone carried authority, but the man did not respond with fear or anger. He remained calm, his posture steady, his hands visible and his gaze unwavering. "You don't need to do this," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just heading home." There was no pleading in his words, no panic, just a quiet assertion of his presence. But the officers, already keyed up, did not see it as a reason to slow down. They only interpreted it as defiance. Suddenly, one of the officers reached for him. The man anticipated the movement, shifting his weight just slightly to avoid a direct grab. The officer stumbled forward a bit, and the man's calm eyes never left theirs. Every step he took was deliberate, measured, and careful. He was not moving aggressively, but he was aware of every potential threat, every angle, and every possible outcome. The first push came next. One officer shoved him lightly, testing his reaction. The man did not stumble. He simply leaned back slightly, keeping his balance, his eyes watching. The shove was intended to provoke, to intimidate, but it did not work. The officers, frustrated, tried again, this time with more force. They were underestimating him, thinking that his size made him easy to overpower. But what they did not realize was that he had been ready for this, had been trained, had faced situations far more dangerous and complex than a street confrontation. Around them, the quiet hum of the neighborhood continued, though faintly. A few birds still chirped from the trees, and the occasional dog barked. The contrast between the calm environment and the tension on the street was striking. Passers-by slowed down, trying to see what was happening. But the man remained the center of the storm, unmoving in spirit, unshaken in resolve. The officers tried to grab his arms, to pull him toward the curb, but he shifted easily, not with force but with control. It was almost like watching someone dancing around obstacles, avoiding them with ease, yet not doing anything flashy or overt. His large frame seemed to absorb their aggression rather than react to it. He was not resisting physically, yet he was not allowing them to dictate his movements either. It was a subtle, almost invisible power. "Step aside," one officer shouted, trying to intimidate him. "We're just doing our job." The man nodded slightly as if acknowledging their words, but he did not step aside. Not yet. He had a reason for every pause, every subtle move, every small reaction. He was guiding them unknowingly into a position of disadvantage without them realizing it. The officers grew more frustrated. Their voices rose, their gestures became sharper, and one of them reached for his belt, preparing to escalate further. The man did not flinch. Instead, he looked around carefully, noting every detail. The distance between him and the officers, the curb nearby, the tree trunks, the lamppost, the security cameras visible on nearby houses. Every element of the environment mattered. He was aware of it all, more than they could ever guess. "Calm down," the man said, his voice steady. "I don't want this to get out of hand. You can step back if you want to handle this properly." There was no sarcasm, no hidden challenge, just a quiet but undeniable authority in his words. The officers did not take a step back. Instead, one of them lunged slightly forward, trying to grab him around the shoulders. The man shifted once again, smoothly, with precision, avoiding the contact. The officers stumbled slightly, caught off guard. He noticed a neighbor holding a phone, quietly recording. A small smile appeared on his face, though he did not draw attention to it. That recording would matter later. Every witness mattered. Every detail mattered. He was aware that this was bigger than just the moment. It was about fairness, justice, and exposing the truth of what was happening. The push and shove continued. One officer grabbed him by the jacket, trying to pin him against a wall. The man stepped aside, subtly redirecting the officer's energy without confrontation. He was careful not to appear aggressive, but every movement was purposeful. The officer did not see the way he had guided him slightly off balance, making the situation more complicated for them, without lifting a finger to fight. Passers-by had stopped now. A few people peeked from windows while others lingered at the end of the street. Some whispered among themselves, unsure of what to do. It was an unusual scene, and they could sense the tension, but none of them could predict how it would resolve. Only the man knew that this was part of a plan, a situation he had thought through carefully before even leaving the store that day. "You need to cooperate," one officer shouted, raising his voice. "We can do this the hard way if we need to." The man did not react with fear. Instead, he remained calm, keeping his breathing steady. He allowed himself a mental note of every reaction, every expression, every micro-movement from the officers. He had studied people like this before, and he knew exactly how their frustration would grow. That frustration would work in his favor if he stayed patient. As the officers became more aggressive, the man's eyes never left theirs. He was alert to every potential movement, ready to act if necessary, but still in full control. He subtly shifted his weight, guiding their energy and movements without them realizing it. He did not need to raise his voice or strike back. His presence alone was enough to create uncertainty in their minds. Then came the moment when one officer decided to use more physical force. He grabbed the man's arm roughly, trying to twist it behind his back. The man adjusted instantly, not resisting but not allowing himself to be overpowered. The officer was surprised by his strength and balance, realizing that this man was not ordinary. Another shove followed, and the man leaned slightly, using the officer's momentum against him. It was subtle, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but it worked. Nearby, a few neighbors whispered among themselves. "He's not fighting back, but he's not being taken down either," one said. "How is he doing that?" They could see that the man was in control, even as the officers tried to dominate him. It was a strange sight, and it made the confrontation even more intense for everyone watching. The officers' frustration grew, and their aggression escalated. They tried to push him toward the curb again, shouting orders, waving their hands, trying to intimidate him. The man shifted once more, calmly, easily, keeping his balance and control. He was large, yes, but it was not just his size that mattered. It was his skill, his awareness, and his patience. He knew that any rash action could end badly, so he continued to move subtly, always a step ahead in his mind. Finally, one officer tried to grab him completely, to force him to the ground. The man adjusted slightly, leaning in the right direction, and the officer lost a fraction of his balance. The second officer tried to assist, but in doing so, they both fell slightly into a position that made them less effective. The man had not made a single aggressive move, but his subtle guidance had begun to show results. It was a quiet, tense battle of wits and balance with the man at the center. He was not angry, not desperate, not afraid. He was calm, patient, and fully aware of what he was doing. Every shove, every grab, every attempt at aggression by the officers was being guided and controlled without their knowledge. He was turning the situation subtly in his favor, step by step, without them realizing it. As the sun set completely, casting shadows over the street, the scene remained tense. The neighbors watched quietly, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. The officers, unaware of the man's control and strategy, continued to push and shove, growling and shouting, convinced that their size and authority would prevail. But the man's calmness and intelligence were slowly turning the tables, and through it all, he never lost sight of his goal: to survive, to maintain control, and to expose the truth of what was happening. The assault was happening in real time, but it was not the end of the story. It was the moment that would set everything else in motion. The man remained calm, aware, and in control, proving that sometimes strength is not just about force but about patience, intelligence, and knowing how to handle a dangerous situation without losing yourself. The street had grown darker now, the last remnants of sunlight fading into deep shadows. The quiet hum of the neighborhood felt distant, almost unreal compared to the tension in the air. The officers were frustrated, their voices sharper, their movements more desperate, but the man remained calm. He had been waiting for this moment, anticipating exactly how their aggression would play out. He wasn't afraid, and he wasn't going to make a rash move. He had a plan, one that required patience, observation, and perfect timing. As the officers advanced again, their frustration clear, the man shifted slightly, moving toward a narrow part of the street that was lined with tall hedges and a few parked cars. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was deliberate. He was guiding them without them knowing into the exact spot he wanted. Each movement, each step, each glance was part of a larger strategy. The officers thought they were controlling him, but in reality, they were stepping into a situation that he had already calculated. The first officer lunged, trying to grab his arm, but the man sidestepped smoothly. It was not a forceful dodge, but a slight adjustment that caused the officer to stumble forward just a bit. The second officer reached to help, but in doing so, they both ended up slightly off balance, closer together than they had intended. The man didn't need to touch them. Their own movements, influenced subtly by his, were enough to create an opening. He had set the stage perfectly. Nearby, a few neighbors watched from their windows, holding their breath. Some whispered quietly to each other, trying to understand what was happening. "Why isn't he fighting back?" one whispered. "He's so calm. How is he doing that?" They had no idea that what they were witnessing was not a fight in the usual sense, but a carefully orchestrated plan. The man's calmness was not weakness, it was power in its quietest form. One officer finally managed to grab his arm, twisting it slightly. The man did not resist. Instead, he adjusted his weight, shifting just enough to make the officer's hold unstable. The officer grunted, surprised by the strength and control in the man's posture. He had expected compliance or resistance, but not this kind of unshakable calm. The second officer stepped closer, trying to assist, but the man anticipated this. He subtly shifted again, guiding their combined momentum in a direction that made them less effective. In that small space, the man had created a situation where their aggression worked against them. They were too close together, moving with too much force and not prepared for the precision with which he handled himself. Every subtle adjustment he made was part of a larger plan, a trap they could not see. He didn't need to raise his voice or strike. His presence alone was enough to manipulate the situation. "Calm down," he said again, his voice soft but firm. "This doesn't have to get worse for anyone." There was no threat, no sarcasm, only a quiet assertion of control. But the officers were too frustrated to hear reason. They continued to shove, pull, and push, thinking that their size and authority would win the day. The man simply observed, calculating, waiting for the exact moment to turn the situation fully in his favor. As he moved subtly toward a corner, he noticed a small security camera mounted on a nearby building. He had passed it before during his routine walks, and now it was part of his plan. He adjusted his position slightly to ensure that everything happening between him and the officers would be captured clearly. He did not call attention to it, and the officers did not notice. They were too focused on their frustration, on their perception of control, to see that they were being filmed from an angle that would later prove crucial. The officers' voices grew louder, their movements more erratic. One shoved him roughly, trying to push him against the curb, but the man shifted his weight just enough to remain steady. His size, which they had assumed made him easy to control, actually helped him maintain balance while subtly directing their energy. Every shove they made, every attempt to dominate him physically, was now slightly misdirected, causing them to lose balance or overcommit. A neighbor quietly started recording on their phone, capturing the scene from the other side of the street. The man noticed this but did not flinch. He had anticipated multiple witnesses, multiple angles, multiple opportunities for the truth to be revealed. He had thought about this confrontation carefully before it even began, and now all the pieces were falling into place. The officers, blinded by arrogance and aggression, had no idea that they were walking into a trap carefully laid out over years of understanding human behavior and situational control. "Stop resisting," one officer shouted again. "We can do this the hard way." The man remained calm, breathing slowly and evenly. He knew that aggression only escalates aggression. By remaining controlled, he was creating doubt in their minds. Subconsciously, they began to question themselves, even if only slightly. That hesitation, that brief flicker of doubt, was exactly what he needed. The next attempt by the officers was to grab him fully, trying to force him to the ground. The man leaned just slightly, using their momentum against them. The first officer stumbled forward, nearly off balance, while the second officer tried to correct him, creating a situation where both were now less coordinated. The man's subtle adjustments were invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for, but they were effective. He was guiding the confrontation entirely without force, without raising his voice, without losing his calm. Around them, the street had grown quiet again, except for the strained voices of the officers. The neighbors watched silently, sensing the shift but unable to fully understand it. Some clutched their hands, holding their breath. Others whispered, amazed at the calmness and control the man displayed. He looked like an ordinary person, large and quiet, but he was anything but ordinary in the way he handled the situation. The man's mind was moving faster than anyone could notice. He was calculating every possible action, every reaction, every chance to take control without physical violence. He had prepared for situations like this in ways no one could see. Years of experience, careful observation, and mental preparation allowed him to remain calm even as others tried to provoke him. He understood human behavior, and he knew exactly how to guide the officers' actions without them realizing it. One officer tried to grab his jacket, pulling roughly, but the man shifted slightly to the side, redirecting the force. The officer's momentum caused him to bump lightly into his partner, disrupting their coordination further. The man did not touch them, did not shout, did not fight. He simply moved with precision, allowing their own energy to work against them. From a distance, the neighbor's phone continued recording. Everything, the shoves, the grabs, the subtle shifts in balance, was being documented. This would become evidence, a clear record of what had really happened, unlike the officer's version that would likely rely only on their perception. The man had anticipated this. He had counted on witnesses, on cameras, on the environment around him, and he had used it all to his advantage. As the officers became more desperate, their coordination failed completely. They were focused on forcing compliance, but the man remained calm and aware. He noticed a small alley just a few steps away. It was narrow, slightly hidden by a row of parked cars and trash bins. He had intended to guide them toward it, a location where their movements would be restricted and his control would be easier to maintain. Slowly, subtly, he edged toward the alley, making it seem like he was simply stepping aside rather than leading them into a carefully prepared trap. The officers, unaware, followed, thinking they were closing in. One more aggressive shove, one more misstep, and the first officer lost balance, his hand catching on a low fence. The second officer tried to steady him, but ended up off balance as well. The man remained steady, his large frame unmoving, his breathing controlled, his calmness almost unnerving. He had drawn them into exactly the position he wanted. The trap was nearly set. Everything, the officers' aggression, their overconfidence, their lack of awareness, had worked in his favor. He had used their own energy against them without laying a hand on them. He had anticipated their moves, guided their positions, and now all that remained was to allow the final pieces to fall into place. Even as the officers struggled to regain control, the man remained calm, observing every detail. The shadows of the alley, the narrow space, the placement of obstacles, and the potential for witnesses all mattered. He had prepared for this confrontation mentally long before it started, and now his preparation was paying off. The officers were acting, reacting, moving, but every step had been subtly manipulated by him, and through it all he remained aware of the humanity around him. He was not reckless. He was not violent. He understood that the goal was not to humiliate or harm, but to survive, to maintain dignity and to reveal the truth. His calm presence was a shield, a tool, and a guide. He was in control, though the officers had no idea, and the situation was about to reach the point where his strategy would reveal itself fully. The alley was narrow, shadowed by tall buildings and lined with parked cars, trash bins, and scattered debris. The dim streetlights cast uneven glows, creating pockets of darkness and light. The officers, still frustrated and aggressive, had followed him without realizing that this was the exact position he had wanted them to be in. Every step they had taken, every shove, every grab had been guided subtly by him. They thought they were in control, but in reality, the balance of power had already shifted. The man's breathing remained calm, even as the officers came closer. He had prepared mentally for this moment, and now everything was unfolding exactly as he had envisioned. He did not need to shout, fight, or struggle. His control came from patience, awareness, and precise timing. He had studied situations like this before, understanding how people react under pressure and how their own energy can be used against them. Now the officers were stepping into the trap without realizing it. One officer lunged toward him, trying to grab his arm again. The man shifted slightly, allowing the officer's momentum to carry him just past a parked car. The officer stumbled lightly, trying to regain balance, but the narrowness of the alley and the presence of obstacles made it difficult. The second officer rushed to assist, but in doing so, he too became slightly off balance. The man's subtle movements had created a situation where the officer's aggression was now a disadvantage. They were too close together, their coordination off and their perception of control fading. From a distance, a neighbor's phone continued recording. Every shove, every grab, every small adjustment was being documented. The man had anticipated witnesses and cameras, knowing that the truth of the situation could be captured even if the officers tried to manipulate it later. His awareness of the environment, combined with his patience and calmness, made him almost untouchable in this moment. He did not need to escalate. The officer's own actions were doing it for him. "Step back," one officer shouted, his voice filled with frustration. "This is your last warning." The man did not flinch. He remained calm, keeping his hands visible, his posture steady. "I am not trying to fight," he said softly. "I just want this to end peacefully. Please think about what you're doing." There was no pleading in his voice, no hint of fear, only a quiet authority that seemed to ripple through the alley. The officers hesitated, just slightly sensing that something was not right. Their aggression had brought them to a position where they were less effective, less coordinated, and more vulnerable to missteps. The man's calmness, patience, and awareness had created a subtle shift in the balance of power. They were acting, reacting, struggling to maintain control, but every move they made played into the trap he had set. Then he acted, not with force, not with anger, but with precision. He shifted his weight again, just enough to guide the first officer into tripping over a low curb hidden in the shadows. The officer stumbled, trying to catch himself, while the second officer reached out to steady him. In doing so, they both became slightly entangled, their coordination further disrupted. The man remained steady, his breathing calm, his eyes observing every detail. He did not need to touch them to gain control. The alley, narrow and cluttered, was working in his favor. The officer's own aggression and frustration had brought them into a position where their movements were restricted and their balance compromised. The man had guided them there subtly without them realizing it. Every shove, every lunge, every misstep had been carefully calculated in his mind, and now the results were visible. A few neighbors peeked through fences and windows, watching silently. Some whispered to each other, unsure of what to say. "Look at him," one whispered. "He's not fighting, but he's not being overpowered either. How is he doing that?" They could see that the man was calm and in control, even as the officers struggled. His presence alone seemed to shift the energy of the situation, creating doubt and hesitation in the officers' minds. The first officer tried to regain his balance, shaking his head and muttering under his breath. The second officer moved to grab the man again, but this time the narrow space and obstacles made it difficult. The man shifted slightly, guiding their momentum once more. The first officer stumbled again, this time bumping lightly into a trash bin, sending a small clatter echoing through the alley. The second officer tried to steady him, but their movements were uncoordinated, awkward, and ineffective. The man's calm eyes never left theirs. He was aware of every detail, the position of the obstacles, the angles of the shadows, the distance between them, and the reactions of the neighbors watching from a distance. He was not aggressive, not angry, not desperate. He was in control, and his control came from observation, patience, and precise timing. "Enough," the first officer shouted, frustration breaking through his attempt at authority. "Step aside, move." The man did not move aggressively. He simply remained calm, adjusting his weight slightly to maintain balance and guide the officers' movements without touching them. The narrowness of the alley made every misstep more consequential, and the officers were beginning to feel it. Their own energy, aggression, and frustration were now their weakness. The man had prepared for situations like this mentally, long before it began. He had studied human behavior, anticipating how people react when frustrated, impatient, or aggressive. He understood that aggression can be redirected, that overconfidence can be used against those who wield it, and that calmness can create hesitation in the most assertive individuals. He had applied all of this knowledge subtly, guiding the officers into a position of disadvantage without them realizing it. One officer attempted another grab, this time reaching for the man's jacket. The man leaned slightly, allowing the officer's momentum to carry him past a parked car. The officer stumbled, trying to regain balance, while the second officer tried to intervene, becoming slightly off balance as well. The man remained steady, his calm presence almost unshakable. He did not need to raise his voice or use force. His awareness and precision were enough. The neighbors continued to watch, some holding their hands over their mouths, others whispering quietly. "He's so calm," one said. "And they're stumbling over everything. How is he doing that?" They could sense the shift in control, the subtle guidance, and the power of the man's patience and observation. It was a quiet kind of strength, one that did not rely on force or aggression but on presence, awareness, and intelligence. The officers, still frustrated and aggressive, were now visibly struggling. Their movements were uncoordinated, their balance compromised, and their perception of control slipping. The man, meanwhile, remained calm, steady, and observant. He had created a situation where their own actions, driven by frustration and aggression, were leading to their disadvantage. He had set the trap, and now it was unfolding. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "I am not your enemy. I am not resisting. I just want this to end without anyone getting hurt." There was no pleading, no fear, no challenge, only quiet authority. The officers hesitated, sensing that their actions were not achieving the result they wanted. Their aggression had led them into a position of disadvantage, and they were beginning to realize, though too late, that they had underestimated him. The man's patience, Calmness and awareness had turned the situation around. What had started as an aggressive confrontation was now a display of subtle control, where every movement, every shove, and every misstep of the officers worked in his favor. The narrow alley, the obstacles, and the environment itself became tools in his hands, amplifying his ability to guide the situation without resorting to force. The officers looked at each other, frustration and confusion on their faces. They had expected an easy encounter, someone they could intimidate and control. Instead, they were facing a man who remained calm, in control, and aware of every detail. Their aggression had backfired, and now the situation was no longer theirs to command. The man's calm eyes swept the alley, noting every possible outcome, every potential reaction, and every detail of the environment. He had guided them into position, anticipated their moves, and maintained control without aggression. The trap he had set was complete, and the officers, unaware of the full extent of their disadvantage, were now caught in it. The scene in the alley became a silent testament to the power of calmness, observation, and strategic thinking. The man had turned a dangerous confrontation into a controlled situation where force and aggression were rendered ineffective. His presence alone shifted the balance of power, demonstrating that strength is not always about size or force, but about awareness, patience, and intelligence. The officers, still struggling to regain control, now faced the reality of their situation. The man had guided them into a position where their movements were restricted, their coordination was disrupted, and their aggression had become their weakness. He remained calm, steady, and in full control, demonstrating a quiet power that was almost invisible but undeniable in its effect. From the shadows of the alley, neighbors continued to watch silently, some whispering quietly. They could see the shift in control, the subtle guidance, and the man's calm presence. It was clear that this was not an ordinary confrontation. The man had used observation, awareness, and precision to turn the situation entirely in his favor, without aggression, without violence, and without losing his composure. And in that moment, as the officers struggled, stumbled, and hesitated, it became clear that the confrontation had changed completely. What had begun as an assault by the officers had become a situation where the man held the advantage, not through force but through patience, intelligence, and the quiet power of awareness. The officers finally realized that the situation had slipped out of their hands. The narrow alley, the scattered obstacles, the subtle guidance from the man, they had all combined to create a trap that they could not escape. Their frustration and aggression had backfired completely, leaving them uncoordinated, off balance, and uncertain. The man, in contrast, remained calm, his breathing steady, his eyes sharp, and his presence commanding. He had not used force or aggression. He had relied on awareness, patience, and precision. And now the truth of the situation was becoming clear. One officer tried to regain control, raising his voice and attempting to assert authority, but his words felt hollow. The other officer shifted uneasily beside him, unsure of how to proceed. The man did not move toward them. He did not threaten them. He simply stood, a steady presence in the narrow alley, letting their own actions expose their mistakes. The balance of power had shifted entirely, and they were now trapped by their own arrogance and lack of awareness. The neighbors who had been watching from their porches and windows began to emerge cautiously, some holding phones to record, others simply leaning out to see what would happen next. Their attention was fixed on the unfolding scene, and they could see clearly that the man was calm, composed, and in control, while the officers struggled to maintain authority. Whispers spread through the neighborhood, murmurs of amazement at how one man, standing quietly, had managed to turn the situation completely around. "Listen to me," the man said, his voice steady, carrying through the narrow alley. "I am not resisting. I am not fighting. I only want this to end peacefully. Please step back and think about what you are doing." There was no anger, no sarcasm, no challenge in his tone. Only calm authority and a clear demand for reason. The officers froze for a moment, uncertain how to respond. They had expected resistance or fear, and instead they were met with composure and intelligence. It was disorienting for them, and it made them hesitate. The first officer, still trying to regain balance, muttered under his breath and looked around. He glanced at the recording devices, at the neighbors watching, and finally at the man standing calmly in front of him. He began to understand that this situation was no longer under his control. Every aggressive action he had taken, every shove, every attempt to intimidate had been documented, and now he could see the consequences of underestimating someone based on appearance or size. The man slowly raised his hands, showing that he was not a threat. His calmness was deliberate, a way to communicate that he had no desire to escalate the situation further. "Step back," he repeated softly. "You have a choice to make. This can end peacefully, or it can get worse for everyone. But right now, I am giving you the chance to do the right thing." The officers hesitated again, now aware that the eyes of the neighborhood were on them, that their own aggression had been witnessed and recorded, and that they were no longer in control. One officer finally stepped back, just a little, trying to regain composure while the other remained tense, unsure of the next move. The man's calm eyes never left theirs. He was fully aware of the delicate balance of power, the opportunity to guide the situation to a peaceful conclusion, and the importance of keeping control over his own emotions. He had achieved what seemed impossible, turning a potentially violent confrontation into a moment where his patience, awareness, and intelligence created a clear advantage. The neighbors' whispers grew louder, though still cautious. They could see that the man was not only standing his ground but was also demonstrating a quiet kind of power that did not rely on force. They could see the officer's frustration and hesitation, and the contrast was striking. The man had achieved control not through aggression, not through size, not through force, but through awareness, calmness, and strategy. It was a lesson in how presence and intelligence could overcome arrogance and aggression. The first officer finally straightened, shaking his head slightly, and muttered something about following orders. The second officer looked around, taking in the recording phones, the watching neighbors, and the calm figure before him. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he began to step back as well. The man did not make a move toward them. He simply observed, allowing the officers to retreat from the narrow space of the alley. Their authority diminished and their aggression deflected. Once the officers were a safe distance away, the man took a deep breath and slowly began to move toward the main street again. He remained calm, aware of the environment, and careful not to provoke any further aggression. The neighbors watched, as he walked steadily, carrying himself with quiet dignity. Some whispered their admiration, others simply shook their heads in disbelief. The man had turned a dangerous situation into a moment of control and justice without violence, proving the power of calm awareness and intelligence. The officers, now regrouping near their vehicle, were left to reflect on what had happened. Their aggression had been countered not by physical strength but by patience, awareness, and strategy. They had underestimated someone based on appearance, and the consequences had become undeniable. Even as they drove away, their frustration and confusion remained, tempered by the realization that the man had not only avoided harm but had also exposed the weaknesses in their approach. The man continued home, walking slowly, his groceries untouched in the moment but safely in his hands. He reflected on what had happened, not with anger, but with quiet satisfaction. He had managed a dangerous confrontation, protected himself, and demonstrated that calm intelligence could be more powerful than aggression. Every subtle movement, every calculated adjustment, and every moment of patience had led to this outcome. He had turned a moment of potential violence into a demonstration of control, awareness, and dignity. Back in his home, the man set his groceries down and sat for a moment, letting the tension of the evening fade. He thought about the neighbors who had witnessed the event, the officers who had underestimated him, and the quiet power of patience and strategy. He had faced a potentially dangerous situation, and through calmness and awareness, he had turned it into a moment of triumph. He understood that real strength was not in aggression, but in the ability to maintain control, observe carefully, and act with intelligence. Later, the recordings from the neighbors' phones and the security camera would provide clear evidence of what had happened. The officers' actions had been documented, their aggression visible, and the man's calm composure undeniable. The community would see the truth, and the man's careful handling of the situation would be recognized as a powerful example of courage and intelligence in the face of aggression. The incident also became a lesson for those who witnessed it. The neighbors understood that appearances could be deceiving, that calmness could be more powerful than aggression, and that intelligence and strategy could overcome even the most forceful attempts at control. The man had shown that patience, observation, and dignity were not weaknesses but powerful tools in moments of conflict. In the days that followed, the story of the confrontation spread quietly through the neighborhood. People spoke of how one man, calm and aware, had managed a dangerous encounter with officers without aggression or violence. They admired the quiet strength, the patience, and the intelligence that allowed him to maintain control. The man himself did not seek attention, but he understood the importance of his example. He had faced a challenge, turned it to his advantage, and demonstrated that real power came from within. The officers faced questions from their department and were reminded of the importance of awareness, patience, and proper conduct. They had underestimated the man, allowed their frustration to guide their actions, and in doing so, exposed the weaknesses in their approach. The truth of the event, captured on multiple devices and witnessed by neighbors, could not be denied. The man had acted with dignity, and the officers had been forced to confront their own mistakes. The man returned to his normal life, carrying with him the lessons of the evening. He knew that patience, awareness, and intelligence were not just tools for confrontation, but for life itself. He had faced aggression, remained calm, and turned a dangerous situation into a moment of clarity and control. The neighborhood respected him not just for what he had done, but for how he had done it, with dignity, calmness, and intelligence. Looking back, the man understood the deeper truth of the experience. Strength was not about size or aggression. It was about awareness, patience, and careful observation. It was about understanding the world, anticipating human behavior, and remaining calm even when others were driven by frustration and arrogance. He had lived this truth, and in doing so, he had demonstrated a quiet kind of power that could not be ignored. The story ended not with violence or fear, but with calm resolution, awareness, and the subtle triumph of intelligence over aggression. The man had faced a challenge, guided it to a controlled outcome, and protected himself while maintaining dignity. It was a story of quiet courage, patience, and the power of remaining calm in the face of hostility. In the end, the man's life returned to its normal rhythm, but the lessons of that evening remained. He had shown that even in the most dangerous situations, calmness, awareness, and intelligence could create control, turn the tables, and demonstrate true strength. The community remembered, the officers reflected, and the man continued to live, with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced a threat, managed it with dignity, and emerged stronger, wiser, and fully in control of himself.